back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively talking some sports, hence my Ravens garb that I've thrown on here. I promised to put the suit on for Dr. Rabowski later on in the week. It's going to be Education Week around here at WNST, as well as incredible conversations with Scott Schellenberger, as well as Brian Frosch. You can find all that stuff out at Baltimore Positive, as well as in our morning newspaper, as well as at WNST.net, as we are merging the brands of Baltimore Positive in our sports operation. No one has done sports better than Luke Jones, and this was a Ravens draft weekend. Luke, I don't know when we're going to talk baseball or basketball or football or anything beyond Michael Jordan Last Dance videos once this draft thing is over, but for the Ravens and for the weekend and the kind of weekend they had, certainly to be feted by the Dan Jeremiahs or the Mel Kipers or whoever gives draft grades and all that, there's a part of this that when DaCosta gets on the clock and they lose the player 2 picks before and they trade out and they get all these third-rounders, it's just the mindset of how many players they want. And having garnered, was it 6 players in the top 106? It was crazy the way they have won the draft the other 362 days of the year by dealing off some punter kicker to the Vikings and stealing their draft picks, you know?
No question, and that's really what the draft comes down to. I mean, we all know you're not going to hit on all your picks. I mean, that's just the truth. Eric DaCosta talked about this a couple weeks ago, that there's more luck involved in this than anyone really wants to admit. But where you win is understanding value, understanding opportunity, and I think that's where the Ravens, far more consistently than not, they've gotten that over the years. And you look at what they were able to do. I mean, you just mentioned it. I mean, I called it the Corey Vedvik pick or the Ved pick. I mean, what they were able to do with acquiring Calais Campbell. Think about the pick they sent to the LA Rams for Marcus Peters. So it's not just picking players. It's understanding the value of that draft capital, whether it is to move up and make a pick, whether it's to move back and pick up an extra pick or two, whether it's to trade for an established veteran, or whether it's just to pick the player where you're scheduled to pick. I mean, it's all of those things. It's not as though one of those things is more important than the other. The draft is about maximizing value, and that's where the Ravens consistently have done a great job over the course of a quarter century now. Doesn't mean every pick pans out. We know not every pick pans out. Of the 10 guys that they drafted over the weekend, even if 5 of them hit, you're talking about this being one of the best drafts in franchise history. That's just the way this works.
Well, one of the things is they're so good at it, and they had such an incredible haul this year, more so than any other year when you consider how many of the top 100 picks they actually had. That is always their goal, right? Like scientifically and from all of the nerddom that we talk about, the sheer science of having more picks higher and lots of them, and you're going to get more better looks at football players to have more shots at Marshall Yondas, let's say, right?
Yeah, and it's a simplistic way of putting it, but it's kind of like, you know, when the lottery is an incredible amount, people in an office, they pull their money together and they get a few more lottery tickets. Now, it's not quite like that. I mean, it's more complicated than that, and you know, by that logic, you trade your first-round pick to get 25 seventh-round picks. No, of course not. But the more picks that you have, as you mentioned, in that top 100, that top 150, however many draftable players a team has, and usually they're somewhere 150 to 180, 185 in any given year, as many picks as you can have in that kind of range, you're drafting guys that you think have a chance to hit. Now, they're not all going to hit. We know that. But you're just improving your odds. So I think from that standpoint, Ozzie Newsome and now Eric DaCosta, who's learned from Ozzie Newsome for so many years, they get that. So I think, especially in this draft, where there were no pro days, you didn't have your official top 30 visit, you had the combine, yes, but you clearly didn't have quite as much additional information. What did the Ravens really value? I think having 10 picks to begin with, or being able to maneuver to have 10 picks, and watching the tape, watching the film, watching what these guys did at the collegiate level. And I think that's where it's kind of interesting to kind of see. And you could even go back the last year or two. The Ravens, it seems as though the last couple of years they've trended a little more towards Power 5 conference guys that have played elite competition. I mean, Patrick Queen, just for one example, he was a first-year starter this past year for LSU, but think about the teams he played at the end of the year, Georgia and Oklahoma and playing Alabama. I mean, just the different teams that he played in his 1 year as a starter. Normally you say 1 year starter for a first-round pick, and you're saying, oh, pump the brakes. But it helps you feel more confident about that player when you know that he's played elite competition, and he's played it really well. I mean, he was the defensive MVP at the national championship game. Now, that's your first-round pick, but go down the list, and you see Ohio State, you see Texas A&M, you see Texas, you see Michigan, Mississippi State, Texas Tech. I mean, even Geno Stone, their final pick, played at Iowa. So you really have seen the Ravens, as much as they had the reputation for taking the small school guys over the years.
Yeah, it's moved a little bit, hasn't it?
It feels like it's shifted a little bit. That's not to say that they don't like those small school players anymore, but perhaps because of teams like the Ravens, maybe you're seeing the rest of the league catch up in that regard, and maybe you're not finding that same hidden value where you take a Brandon Williams in the third round because, well, he played at a lower level, and 25 other teams, I'm just making up a number arbitrarily, but 25 other teams didn't even bother scouting the guy.
Well, hang on a minute, because I'm in the third round right now, and I'm on the main website here, right? So, if you look at all of those kids, you talk about Matabuke, then the next pick was, much further down the line in Duvernay. The schools around there, come on now, Alabama, Utah, Alabama, Missouri, Mississippi State, Florida, UCLA, Texas. The pick after Duvernay was Appalachian State. Now, that's a little different, but for the most part, Connecticut came up later with Matt Peart. Charlotte was a little later with Alex Highsmith. I mean, we were all watching the draft on Friday, right? So, especially late into the night when the Ravens had all these picks going in, up into midnight, and Mississippi State Dayton was another pick. But, the especially on a weekend where Scottie Pippen was featured, right? And you're watching the last hits. There's no more of those kind of schools in the third round anymore. Those kinds of guys don't wind up at Richmond. They wind up transferring to Virginia, right?
I mean, and there are a lot of factors. And look, we're also talking about 1 year, but I think even the small school guys, again, with the pandemic and not having pro days and maybe not collecting as much information, you rely on the tape a little more. And what's the problem? You're talking about the small school guys. Now, they might be incredibly talented NFL caliber players, but
yeah, you can only look at the Towson film so long, and God bless Towson, and realize, okay, maybe there's a Joe Flacco in that league, but that's generational. That's not something that's going to happen every year.
Exactly. And then if you don't have quite as much information from a measurable standpoint, some player didn't run at the combine and his pro day was canceled, you just don't have as complete information. So maybe you do skew a little more Power 5 conference, high competition, and of course you're focusing on the game tape way more. So it's just, I don't know that for a fact, but it's just interesting to look at the draft class. But you could even look at last year's draft class for the Ravens, and they were a little more Power 5 heavy there. I mean, Marquise Brown, Oklahoma. I mean, I think Louisiana Tech, where Jalen Ferguson came out of, that I think he was their only non-Power 5 school guy. So maybe that's just something to observe and monitor over the next couple of years. There's always the ebbs and flows to scouting and trends that you see around the league. So it's just, it's interesting in that regard. And I thought, just to see it play out that way just made you think a little bit as far as what that might have meant in terms of very challenging circumstances. I mean, Eric DeCosta talked about it at length after the draft, that this kind of had an old school draft feel to it because they they relied so much more on the tape than they already do, and that's saying a lot.
Well, and I go through this, and I've been at this a long time, and I think if you put these up on a board, and it's for people like you and me and real nerds and probably a lot of the folks that are watching or listening, if you're an old school Ravens fan, I could hold the press guide up, or you can go online and see the numbers that come off next to drafts, whether it's pick 4 and 26 with Ogden and Lewis to see where those numbers are. But when I went to bed Friday night, it really sort of dawned on me like, oh my God, it's like they cheated the league in a year where they were 14-2 to go to bed on Friday night and to say, well, the rest of the draft doesn't matter so much. But it really felt that way to some degree, and no disrespect to any of the kids that were drafted, but I ran around on Saturday, and I mentioned I went over to East Baltimore, and I saw all my sponsors, and I saw Chad over at Al's, and I stopped by Icy Delights, and I even rolled by Andy at G&A Coney Island up in Highland. But I was moving around over the weekend. I picked some Royal Farm Stout up. But I was watching the draft, but I wasn't as glued to it. I felt like Friday night was really like if you stayed up late, that was sort of rarefied air to pick 4 football players in the top. You call it 100. You get up to 106 with this kid Phillips from Mississippi State was sort of the Mr. Irrelevant of the round or whatever at the end of the night. But it was sort of a legendary couple of days for the Ravens because they kept picking late. And as I got up on 11 o'clock, I tweeted out like, one of these 4 guys is going to be a $50, $75 million football player because the Ravens are good at it like that.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell. I think, what it reminded me of was go back to that 2016 draft. Remember, they had 5 fourth-round picks, and that was very heralded. But go back and look at it. Did it work out probably as well as they dreamed? Probably not. But, hey, again, you know that not everyone's going to hit. You know that you're not drafting future starters at every pick. You dream about it, but, that 4th round in 2016, Tavon Young hit, even though he's had trouble staying on the field. Chris Moore, I mean, he's been fine. Good, decent special teams player. Alex Lewis looked like he might hit for about a year, but then piddled out after that in terms of here in Baltimore anyway. Willie Henry, didn't last. Kenneth Dixon couldn't stay on the field. So you always have these plans of having that rarefied air, franchise transcending kind of opportunity. And, you look at this 3rd round, and if Justin Matabuki becomes a starting defensive tackle in 2021, great. If Devin Duvernay becomes their slot receiver, and probably we'll see him in the mix some this year, but again, probably more so next year and beyond when Willie Snead presumably moves on. Great. Malik Harrison, I already mentioned this to you in some of our previous conversation. I think he can be a guy that he could start from year one just because they had such a need at inside linebacker where they took Patrick Queen and then they double dip with Harrison, who is more of the traditional downhill run-stopping inside linebacker who can probably blitz a little, but probably not a guy you want to see in coverage very often. And then, I think what's interesting is you mentioned Tyree Phillips, and we can even throw Ben Bredesen into this. They're pick in the 4th round. We'll talk about this a lot, and understanding there's uncertainty with, we know there aren't going to be spring workouts. We'll see if there's training camp. We'll see if there's a season. We don't know.
Man, how do you get a depth chart out of this, right?
And that's what I think is tricky in trying to project some of these guys. And I know our pal Aaron Schatz from Football Outsiders tweeted this over the weekend, and I retweeted it. It's one thing to talk about a first-round pick like a Patrick Queen coming in and starting year one. Yeah, you feel pretty confident about that, or you wouldn't have taken the guy in the first round. But I do think, and this isn't a Ravens thing, this is a 32-team NFL-wide thing. I do think it's going to be fascinating in the same way that, we talked about this in 2011 with the lockout, that talking about the Ravens specifically with trying to replace Marshall Yanda, it's easy to look at Tyree Phillips and Ben Bredesen and say, okay, they're going to be in the mix and they're going to compete for the right guard job. Well, they're also going to be limited to working with Joe D'Alessandris on a tablet for the foreseeable future and working out on their own. So that's where you probably lean a little more toward the incumbents, Patrick McCarry, Ben Powers being in the program for a year already. So that's where I think with some of the rookies beyond the top 30, beyond the top 40, top 45, you probably, in general, should temper expectations a little bit for how these guys develop, because they're just, not only are they not going to be in the building with their coaches and teammates, a lot of these guys are just trying to figure out ways to adequately work out right now. Because, especially talking about young guys, they haven't had the financial wherewithal to be able to build a gym in their house. Some of these guys are. Mark Andrews talked about it a couple weeks ago. He's been doing. He's kind of quipped that he was doing prison workouts in his backyard. He has a bench and some free weights, and he's running and trying to do as much as he can, but certainly doesn't have what the Ravens have in Owings Mills. So I think from that standpoint, expectations across the board probably need to be tempered for these rookies, because it's just it's a very challenging set of circumstances. But again, the Ravens are in the same boat as everyone else in that regard. So not something to be panicked over, just something to understand that is part of the current environment and the current reality of this, assuming we do play football in 2020, which, again, that's an unknown.
Well, the Harrison pick's fascinating, too. I mean, all the way around, the fact that they took a running back in the second round, and whether that's applauded, lauded, or booed or whatever, there was enough booing of Roger Goodell to last me a lifetime. I'm done with that. But, the Queen Harrison thing is interesting on the Andrews Hurst way, or even Orlando Brown, to say, like, who knows that Harrison doesn't wind up being a better football player? I mean, or that Duvernay winds up being, I don't know, name any of the Clarence Moores, that have flamed out, or, winds up being a Torrey Smith type that winds up being a really good football player that has incredible value. But the sheer number of 6 of these guys in the top 106, there have been some years they've only had 2 or 3. To look at the numbers and the way they hit, and to your point, bigger schools, guys they like, guys that Kuiper thought were 20 picks higher, all of these things that sort of bake into this to say, 3 or 4 of these guys might be starting football players around here in the next 2 or 3 years, because they certainly have the pedigree to do that. And that's not taking anything away from the kid from Michigan, that obviously John's brother got a better look at, and the big guy from Texas Tech, as well as the wide receiver from SMU, to go through the late picks. But I was really focused when I went to bed on Saturday morning, waking up saying, when's the last time they've pulled names like this out where most of these guys were thought to be second-round guys, really?
Yeah. I think Malik Harrison's a great example of that. I mean, he's someone that had been mocked to the Ravens, not in the first round, but if the Ravens had gone in a different direction in the first round, certainly saw some arguments and some projections that he could be their second-round pick. So to get him late in the third round, and as I said, I mean, let's face it. What was this inside linebacker group before draft weekend? It was L.J. Fort and a whole bunch of question marks. Chris Board and Tara Alaka, who was a rookie free agent who made the roster last year but got hurt early in the season before he got a chance to show what he could do. You were talking about a very nondescript group. I mean, even L.J. Fort's primarily been a backup and a special teams player over the course of his career. So there was very much an argument to be made to take 2 inside linebackers. So to come away with Queen, who clearly has the upside, but I think it's also fair to mention he's really light. He is only a guy who started for 1 year at LSU, so there's some volatility there. He's not a completely safe pick by any means, but you love the upside, you love the athleticism, you love his ability to cover. I think assuming you, and this goes back to the old Ray Lewis argument, assuming you have a stout, strong defensive line in front of him, then Patrick Queen should be able to roam and make plays. So I don't have a big concern there, but it's fair to note he is lighter. So that's where then you bring in Malik Harrison into the fold. Not that they're going to be competing, because reality is you need 2 inside linebackers. Malik Harrison probably fits the mold of a more traditional Mike linebacker who's going to come off the field in passing situations, kind of what you used to think of middle linebackers before Ray Lewis, right? I mean, you always thought of those middle linebackers, even in the 90s, as guys that were thumpers and they played downhill and they tackled and they were really good against the run. But if you were in an obvious passing situation, you might take them off the field and leave, kind of a weak side player to be in coverage. So So I think you could very well see a scenario where Malik Harrison's their Mike linebacker on first and second down, let's say, and Patrick Queen's their Will weak side inside linebacker, and he's on the field every play, except maybe at the goal line. Maybe that's the one scenario where Queen comes off the field, and Malik Harrison's the guy, and someone else that's a little bit more of a physical type guy. But to be able to bring in Harrison, I think that was he's a guy that's higher floor in terms of playing the run, and he's bigger. He's kind of that more traditional way that you used to think about an inside linebacker. So I think it allows the Ravens to play a little more dime, some big dime that they got away from a little bit more last year because they just didn't have the numbers at inside linebacker, and they leaned a little more on their secondary and ran way more free safety dime. But now you can play a little more big. I think I said big dime. I meant big nickel, where you still have two linebackers on the field, and you kind of get after it that way. So I think Malik Harrison, being a guy who played a lot at Ohio State, he has limitations in coverage, but you like everything else about him. So to get him with the 98th overall pick, I think of their day 2 and day 3 guys that I think can make an immediate impact, he's a guy that with J.K. Dobbins, of course, just because he's going to fit in between Mark Ingram and Gus Edwards most likely. But I think Harrison's a guy who really has a good chance to contribute and contribute a lot from day one. I think he fits that kind of profile.
Luke Jones is here. We are dissecting all things Ravens draft. You can find all of our work out on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and all of those places we are sort of awaiting the awakening after the pandemic for the rest of the sports world. Luke, I don't even know what the next step is, right? Like, I don't think the schedule's coming out on Wednesday, right? I don't think any of that's happening, that we're just in this standstill mode. But for one weekend, it was widely lauded with kids jumping on dad's lap and, moms and wives and high fives. And in Bill O'Brien's case, probably a camera he wants to get off of at this point. I saw that one live as well. I watched a lot of the draft, certainly on Thursday night and Friday night when I didn't fall asleep on picks, as I almost always do as an old guy at this point. It was, I guess it was appropriate. I don't know what else to say other than the Roger Goodell. He looked like he was falling asleep and needed a hot cocoa on Friday night.
Yeah, I was joking that on Saturday I was really disappointed he wasn't going to continue to announce the picks because you saw him gradually getting more tired over the course of...
As I got more, he was making me tired.
Right, but I would have loved to see him just continue to that shtick, and then he's announcing the picks on Saturday in a bathrobe and like he's wearing a fake beard. That it just shows how weathered he's gotten.
Dude, I'm like, Roger, don't fall asleep. We got 3 more picks in this hour, man. I mean,
right.
And it literally, all the picks he made, Duvernay, Harrison, Phillips, they're going to have funny stories, right, about how they got picked.
No question. But I'll say this. Roger Goodell, the NFL, they've gotten criticized for a lot of stuff over the years, and much of it justly deserved, let's face it. But I have to give the league, I have to give ESPN and NFL Network a lot of credit. I mean, they put together, when you really think about this kind of television broadcast that they put together with all of these different personalities, all these different coaches, all of these different general managers, owners, the top 40 or 50 players that they showed after being selected and going into their living rooms and seeing their mini celebrations. You think about all the IT people, all the people that worked behind the scenes from a production standpoint for the broadcast. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of people that had to work from hundreds of locations to make this thing happen, and it was really well done. Okay, there was some hokey stuff. The booing Roger Goodell thing kind of jumped the shark, but there were some charitable tie-ins, and the league raised so much money for the coronavirus pandemic, different causes.
Can we cheer Roger Goodell next year for beer? Can we do that, or can we do something other than boo? Can we find some other middle fingers, pinkies, something? Something different than booing.
Well, what's funny, though, is it's now jumped the shark, right? The booing has become, it became a thing
uncool.
it became a term of endearment for Roger Goodell. Booing it used to be malicious. It used to be, there used to be acrimony there. Now it's much more. It's much more. That was more of an endearment kind of thing. Kind of reminds me of wrestling, where I think of Kurt Angle, his theme song, and the fans would chant "You suck," kind of over in a kind of rhythmic way with his theme song. Originally, that was done because he was a bad guy and they didn't like him. But then, as he got deeper into his career, they still said the "You suck," but it was actually they were saying that as a funny little way of saying that they love him.
Did they make a little cartoon with Roger Goodell doing the Hulk Hogan? Like if they could have made a little cartoon with Roger just doing one of these every time they did it and a little Bud Light logo on there, I probably would have liked that better than having Roger turn back at the television and say, "Come on, louder," 98 times on Thursday and Friday. I just thought that was kind of weak. But look, I'm not going to beat it up. I mean, it was appropriate. It was the weekend. We have a bunch of picks. Now I guess the point is, what do we do now? And I guess we're back to awkward. It's, here we are, and then we pick players, and it was a good idea. Now what are we going to do? I don't know if we're going to play football, and I guess that's, I can leave it there and drop the mic at that point unless you have more for us off of the draft.
I think, first of all, it's worth mentioning the Ravens are going to be starting online work this week. They're going to be having, kind of instructions for workouts. And I mean, the guys that have been in the program, they understand. I mean, they've worked with Steve Saunders and the strength and conditioning and training team to understand, kind of what that looks like. They're going to be getting the rookies up to speed in that regard. John Harbaugh explained this on Saturday, that coaches are allowed to have one-on-one time, which is going to be so huge for rookies. And when I mean one-on-one, obviously remotely, Zoom, FaceTime, take your pick, whatever forum you want to use. So they're going to be able to do those things, but we know it's going to be limited. We know they're not doing anything in the spring. I mean, that's obvious at this point. Dick Cass said weeks ago that was going to be the most likely outcome, and we see where we are right now is, we're just getting to the point where some states are starting to open up some aspects of society, but we're still, very early in that process right now. The only thing I'll say, and look, no one really knows. We don't. I mean, look, as it feels like this pandemic and how our daily lives have changed, we feel like it's been a long time now. It's been 6 or 7 weeks. So I'll say from an optimistic standpoint, not that in 6 or 7 weeks we're going to be back to normal by any stretch of the imagination. I think we all understand that. But I'll remind everyone, we're still 3 months away from when training camp is scheduled to start. 3 months is a long time. So if you're going to ask me to bet right now, I would I don't think we're going to see fans in the stands in 2020. Do I think we could still have football, though, in some different capacity? I think there's still chances for that. I don't know how high the chance is. It's non-zero. I'm not going to say it's zero because a lot can happen in 3 months. But in the meantime, these guys are going to try to get ready the best they can. There's going to be doing a lot of remote and online instruction, and they're going to be trying to get ready for a 2020 season. And that's what you want. Prepare, and you prepare for the best, and you prepare for scenarios that are more favorable, but we also understand that it may not be in the cards. And preparing for it and making plans, and even you mentioned the schedule. The league's kind of floated out there. Second week of May we could hear a schedule come out, but I'm guessing much like the 2011 schedule. If you recall, they had revisions and they kind of structured that thing where they could modify. They could cancel some games early on or reschedule games early on. They structured the division games in a way that they could kind of shift some things around. I guarantee you, whenever we do see a schedule, you're going to see a schedule that is going to be very flexible in terms of modifying, in terms of starting a season late, in terms of ending a season early, depending on what's going to happen, and second wave being accompanied by flu season, and all the different scenarios we've all heard and will continue to hear in the weeks and months ahead. So they're going to prepare. They're going to hope for a season. You want these guys to be ready because we want football if it is possible, of course. So we're just going to have to see how it plays out. And, yeah, it's going to be different because, we're not going to be reporting live from Owings Mills for OTAs, and we'll see how things go from there. But it was definitely fun to have the draft over the weekend. And I said it to you before the draft, and we'll continue to talk about it. The draft, it's about the future. It's about hope. It's about envisioning what's going to happen ahead. And we'll have football again. It's just we just don't know exactly when and how it's going to look.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke. He will be out on the Instagram, the Twitter, the LinkedIn, the Facebook, here at WNST.net, and, of course, all of our Baltimore positive stuff rolling in this week. Continuing with arts, moving on to education, talking about the Attorney General and laws and criminals and all of that stuff that we've talked about. Brian Frosch is at Baltimore Positive this week, as is Scott Schellenberger, but we are getting around education, arts, picking up the pieces, and next week moving back onto the political front as we get closer to the election on June 2nd. Plenty of sports, plenty of NFL draft recap coming your way around here at WNST.net. AM 1570, Baltimore and Towson. And don't forget about Baltimore Positive. We're keeping calm, we're staying local, and we are Baltimore Positive.